Welcome to Serverless Innovation Day, everyone. I'm Nick Coult, General Manager of Amazon Elastic Container Service. Pretty happy to be here today with George Mao, who's a Senior Distinguished Engineer at Capital One. George, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here. I know you've been on a journey with serverless at Capital One for a number of years, and I'm really excited to hear more about that story from you.
Yeah, sure. So as you know, we started our journey with AWS many years ago. We decided to go all in on AWS Cloud, and we closed our last data center back in 2020. And our goal was to get out of data centers so that we could have AWS operate us in the cloud. Since then, we decided that serverless compute would be our default choice of compute when appropriate. And so that means that Lambda and Fargate are our two primary tech choices. And ever since then, we've had to modernize everything from the tooling that we use to our testing applications, and we've had to upgrade our enablement and deploy training mechanisms for our engineers. Moving to Lambda is a little bit of a challenge at the beginning because it's a very large change in the way developers build applications. Typically, instead of building large monolithic apps with like Java or Spring Boot, you build them in smaller components and you scale them independently, which also allows you to be very focused on building the applications that help deliver value for our customers. And that means AWS handles all of the heavy lifting of operating systems and infrastructure and patching and all that stuff. So we're well underway on the journey, but we have a lot more to accomplish. And AWS is a great partner with us here.
One of the interesting things that I often think about with serverless in a highly regulated domain like financial services is, to what extent can adopting serverless actually help you address some of the challenges that you might see there? And because some people might wonder, well, can you use something like serverless in an environment like that where you're essentially handing over a lot of the management to somebody else?
Yeah.
And I think you've had some good learnings along the way there, and I know people would love to hear about that, about how serverless can actually help in a highly regulated environment.
Yeah, sure. So it's not really all that different from any other environment. The most important piece of this is we have to understand the risks that we're taking and also apply the correct governance and compliance for those risks. Right. So when we adopt any AWS service, the first thing we do is put it through a very rigorous adoption process. And basically what that results in is the analysis of the entire service. And then at the end, we identify controls that we have to put in place. And so we work directly with AWS to help us through this process. And then the end result is we just have controls that are identified, and then we build mechanisms to make sure we're compliant. And so an example would be like for Lambda, one of the controls is that we need to be VPC enabled, and so that we can control all network traffic, right? And that's a very easy thing to do on AWS, but we just need the tools to enforce that this is happening. So another thing we do is all releases have to happen through a central standardized pipeline, and we call that our one pipeline. And just like AWS or just like Amazon, it's everybody flows through a single pipeline, and that pipeline enforces all of our controls. So that makes us confident in that we're releasing the right software and that it's compliant and it's meeting our best practice standards. And the last thing is you might have heard of something called Cloud Custodian, and it's actually an open source tool, and it's kind of our audit and reactionary tool that is constantly looking at things that are happening in our AWS environment. So anytime something is released, anytime an application is changed, an API call is made, Cloud Custodian is reviewing those changes and making sure that the controls are met. Right? So I'm going to release a Lambda that is publicly accessible. Cloud Custodian is going to detect that, and it's immediately going to react. So it's all about risk control, knowing where the risks are, applying governance, and then centralizing on a release process.
Yeah, sure. That makes a lot of sense. So, you said that you're on a journey here, and that your journey isn't done. There's more to do. And one of the things I love about working with customers like Capital One is that we're on that journey together, right? And we can actually innovate together. And not only are we helping you, but you're working with us on our future plans that then feed back into the things that you're doing. So tell us a little bit more about that process and how you see that happening with Capital One and serverless on AWS.
Yeah, so this is the part I love. So we've recently created an internal serverless center of excellence, and that the COE is designed to help us establish best practices and standards across our entire enterprise. And AWS is actually a representative in that COE. So we have a large team of specialist solutions architects that advise us on questions and issues that come up. They provide us a really good connection into the service teams that are building the tools that we're using. And we leverage, our account team. Anytime there's a case, anytime a production issue or a thing that needs to be researched, we use our TAMs or technical account managers, and they help us. They guide the case along and make sure everything's addressed as quickly as possible. So we like to think of Amazon as an extension of our development teams, and we work with them to make sure everything is successful.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to double click on one aspect of that, which is that you talked about the journey that you've been on to migrate from data centers to serverless on AWS, and I'm sure in the financial services industry, when you're running your own data center and you're having to operate in a highly regulated domain, there's a lot of things you have to do that it would include the physical security of the servers, the operating system, the patches that are applied to the operating systems. So tell us a little bit more about the extent to which adopting serverless actually makes it easier and accelerates your ability to be compliant in that regulated domain.
Yeah, that's totally true. So for anybody who's running on bare EC2, you own the responsibility of everything on that instance. So operating systems, patches, the images you deploy to it, everything is your responsibility. We do operate those. Not everything we own is serverless, which means we have to do all of that work, right? And that is an enormous amount of work for an engineering team. So when we move to something like Lambda, our developers, their first task is basically just writing application code. And they don't have to spend time doing any of those things that teams on EC2 have to do. And so being in a regulated industry means for us, we have to go through a process called rehydration. And this happens every 60 to 90 days. And that requires us to essentially rebuild an EC2 instance from ground up and address updates, vulnerabilities, and everything that may be a problem for that instance. Rehydration on Lambda is primarily just removing library vulnerabilities, if there are any, and then updating a couple config settings. So I think, when I talk to engineers who are in both worlds, like their lives are immensely better when they move to Lambda. And then on the Fargate side, it's kind of like in the middle, right? So Fargate engineers don't have to worry about the EC2 instance, but they still have to address some of those Docker container vulnerabilities. And that's where the sweet spot is for us. We don't want to spend too much time managing vulnerabilities, and we don't want to spend any time managing network and infrastructure when AWS can do it for us.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I love so much about serverless is it's not just that it's taking away work and making things faster, it's that it's changing how you do business, right? Like the job of a developer now has changed. So that has a lot more implications than just that something got faster or it got cheaper. So that's just something that I'm so passionate about in the world of serverless, is helping our customers change how they do business. Customers love hearing from other customers. That's one of the questions I get all the time when I'm meeting with customers is, hey, can you tell us about some other examples of customers who've gone through this journey? And so you've had a lot of great insights to share with us here on the journey that Capital One has been on. Beyond what you've already shared, like if you had advice for somebody who's looking at doing a large-scale modernization effort like what you've been doing, what advice would you have for those customers?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think you don't have to do everything at once. I think that's the most important thing to understand. You can have applications that are half serverless or 75% serverless, but start with something small and pick something that is easy to convert. And then once you build some knowledge, some engineering expertise, and just internal best practices, you can then expand out to larger and larger use cases. So like for us, we know that APIs is one of our largest use cases. But it doesn't mean you should start with your most critical and complex APIs. Right? You should start with something that is maybe smaller and then build your best practices so your engineers understand how to use Lambda and the newer managed services. From there, once you're ready, I think engage AWS. You can essentially use the solutions architects as like a reference and have them look at your architecture. They can double check that you're making the right architectural design choices and just make sure you're not missing something. For example, you might be building an S3 system, and in order to scale S3 properly, you want to have the right prefixes. But if you didn't do that and you didn't review it with AWS, you might have missed that. So that's what I'd recommend. Work with AWS and start small and then go bigger and bigger.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice, and we love to help people on that journey, starting small. And I would say, beyond the solutions architects teams, the service teams too. Like, we want to hear if you have something you're working on and you feel like there's something that could be improved in the service. That's part of that journey too, that we love working with customers and hearing that kind of feedback because it helps us drive the roadmap for our products.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks, George. As always, great to talk to you. And thanks, everyone, for attending this session at Serverless Innovation Day. I hope you have a great time with the rest of the sessions.
Thanks for having me.